Hi guys, and welcome. Nebon here. We are in the copy of my single-player multiplayer server world, checking out the brand spanking new Minecraft update Aquatic 1.13 pre-release 11 to answer one of the life's most important questions. What's up? What's up with chunk loading? In general, 1.13 brought a lot of changes to the basic game mechanics. For example, my very compact layout for a villager breeder is broken because they fixed the mob's water thingy. That's actually a fairly recent fix, so now if I plop water here, this is now sufficient to grab these guys from their cells. So no more villagers in the stripe here where the water is. Also, because items are not flat on the ground when they're going through water streams, none of these guys would actually pick up the food. So you'll need to raise them up a bit, like by putting them on a fence post. Which unfortunately doesn't make it the very original design anymore, since now it looks awfully like a Minerva's villager breeder. Maybe except for tighter spacing on the water streams and a cool use of the new waterlock stair mechanics to align the items in the middle. Also, the zero population village trick I showed seemed to be working just fine, so this here would be all the fixes for the breeder itself. A little bit sad that the ultra compact design is now broken, but what can you do? These changes here kinda made sense. I might go through all my fun farms checking which one is non-functional anymore in 1.13, but this one seems to be broken the most. Also, some of you have reported that the catching platform for the mob farm now flows to the outside, which is just one of the 1.13 world conversion bugs. Here we'll be talking about them a little bit, where it updates some water blocks and this causes the catching platform to overflow. I was just here testing how to redid the edge of it in 1.13 and everything seems to be working just fine. It's now just placing water on top of slabs is just a little pain in the neck, but it still can be done. So what's up with the chunk loading? A lot have changed since 1.12 with this regard. A lot, I mean pretty much just one line in the code, but a very important one. I don't want to keep this video very long, but on the other hand, I want to explain everything, so I might be skipping over some details of data structures and how information is stored in hash maps and hash sets, but if you're interested, my previous video on Permaloader goes a little bit more in depth with it. But TLDR, the global Permaloader that would protect pretty much all the loaded chunks in the world from unloading is gone. I mean, it's prohibitively expensive for most players right now and will be very complex, but on the other hand, a small permanent chunk loading that would allow us to have 100% reliable mob switches that doesn't require special mobs like shulkers, withers or elder guardians, especially if we are not picky with regards to the specific chunk where we want to store the mobs, could actually a little bit easier to do. So here, right after the conversion, as you can see around that, is a total failure. And this is a little bit weird because this one is not based on any permaloader, which is a little bit strange. It's just a bunch of hoppers pointing from spawn to the spawner. At first I thought maybe hoppers are not good for chunk loading anymore. We had a discussion on Discord regarding that, but then I realized after much testing and frustration was going on that with upgrading to 1.13, some hoppers in the grid don't have items anymore. So apparently upgrading to 1.13 will empty some of those containers like chests and hoppers that are on the chunk borders, which is a big deal if you have some valuable things in your chests, but it is actually not that big of an issue with chunk loading, as most of these chunk loading grids gonna be useless anyways. So let's briefly recap how chunk loading and unloading works, how it was realized in 1.12 and how it is changed in 1.13. Unloading of chunks is important for world autosaving, which naturally happens every 45 seconds. At this point, all the chunks that are not in the range of any player or spawn chunks are being collected and queued for unloading. The game then unloads them 100 at a time in each consecutive tick, and if a particular chunk presents some sort of activity before it gets unloaded, it's kept alive. The general idea behind the Permaloader was to manipulate which first 100 chunks get unloaded, because these ones have no chance to stay loaded, giving the other ones a chance to keep themselves in the game. And the simplest way to do it was using hoppers. A hopper each tick, if it's not on transfer cooldown, will attempt to suck in items from above it, if it's not already full, and attempt to push an item out if it's not empty. So a hopper like this one with one item in it, so not empty nor full, will try to do both. The action of yanking items from above causes the block above to get ticked to look for a container block, like a chest for example, and the action of pushing items out ticks the block the hopper points to. And requesting a single block causes the entire chunk to be marked as active. So if we, for example, place a hopper pointing into another chunk, that hopper will stay on guard for this and this chunk as well. And by chaining them, we can continue loading more chunks. I think it used to be instantaneous, but in 1.12 for sure, and now in 1.13, it takes 1 tick per hopper in a chain. And the hoppers like this one, contrary to popular beliefs, don't cause too much unnecessary lag. I mean, with hoppers it depends a lot on how the hopper is located and what it's doing. Ilmango has already shown some crazy laggy hopper configurations, and Masa from Psycraft found a single hopper that can take almost half of the world's CPU resources. But this one in particular is not one of these. It's far more important what the hopper loads in these chunks. I've been testing some hopper chunk loading solutions in a flat world, and a 1.12 Permaloader with a Mobswitch was taking about a millisecond each tick for its own needs, so I wouldn't worry about the hopper CPU usage. So in 1.12, unloading was using a hash set that is built in Java itself, which organizes chunks into buckets based on a hash code derived from the chunk X and Z position. The formula for this hash code was very simple, which resulted in a very pretty chunk unloading configurations, and the hash set itself was storing all the chunks with the same code in separate buckets, so when these chunks were requested, there was no confusion which chunks from which buckets come first. One of the cool findings of that research was the fact that in this pretty fractal pattern of chunks unload priority, all the chunks on world diagonals had a hash code of 0, meaning that they would always be first for unloading, which meant that due to the 100 chunks per tick unload limit, if you would load at least 100 chunks from the diagonals, all the other loaded chunks in the world will receive a chance to claim being useful. This was annoying a little bit because with chunks that tick every tick, like containing hoppers or end gateways, there are a few blocks that are active every tick. You wouldn't be able to unload them from the memory, but what it allowed to do was to permanently and remotely load any area that was not on the world diagonal. So that's how it was in 1.12. In 1.13, Minecraft uses Open Hashset from third-party library that offers a simpler, more textbooks implementation of this set. And from the cryptographic perspective, it uses much stronger hashing algorithm which uses a golden ratio, which is the most irrational from all the numbers. The Numberphile YouTube channel had a good video explaining what does it mean, but in this case it means that we are pretty much screwed in terms of being able to find something periodic about the new chunk unload configurations. Another monkey wrench thrown in the works of predictive chunk loading is the fact that now chunks with the same hash code, also known as hash collisions, are handled within that table without the use of any additional structures. Which means that the position of a chunk in this table is no longer guaranteed. For example, if a chunk that interests us has a hash code of 1 and gets added first, it'll end up in that spot. But if we have some other chunks with hash code 1 and 2 already in the table, it will be added at position 3, for example. Thankfully, collisions happen rarely, but we would like to want to add a little bit of extra leeway to our 100 chunks, just to be sure whether our chunk in question is on this 100 chunk list or not. Another aspect that became important in this case, which it wasn't before with regular Java hash maps, is hash resizing. When a list of chunks to unload fills 75% of the existing table, the table sizes gets doubled and existing items gets put in a new table using the new extended hash code. So if we have a chunk we want to protect, we have to make sure that it stays roughly where we want it to stay for various possible sizes of the hash table. The size of this hash table grows naturally if we have more chunks to unload and can shrink in very rare cases. But since this table is emptied every time we flush all the unnecessary chunks, its size would typically stay bounded by some reasonable numbers. I mean, how many chunks in the same tick will be able to unload? 4,000, maybe 8,000? So the size of this hash set will never go into some crazy numbers. The only situation it can shrink by half is when we end up with a collision that loops and carries over to the beginning of the table, and then the hash table will shrink by the factor of 2 each time we remove such a carried item. It's a little quirky how it works, but I guess that's how it's implemented. So the table shrinkage will happen from time to time, just not regularly and not predictably, although we can cause it artificially by making the game load and unload a few chunks that end up colliding at the end of this table. The last kind of implementation quirk is the fact that the new hash set returns the items from the back of the line rather than from the beginning, except for chunk 00, which is always returned first. Which means that if you want to protect the chunk from unloading, it needs to be at the beginning of this list rather than at the end of it, because we'll unload this portion of chunks first before we get to our chunk in question. So unfortunately it is not easy to protect an arbitrary area of chunks, as they will likely be scattered across the entire table. But if we need to protect a specific chunk, or better, we are flexible in terms of which chunk we want to protect, this task actually becomes easier than before with Java hash maps due to a nice random position of chunks in the hash map. So a good candidate chunk to stay permanently loaded would have a low order in that table for various potential hash table sizes. Another useful chunk to have is a chunk that would end up at the end of this table and potentially roll over to the beginning. Chunk loading more than 100 of them would mean a comeback of the global Permaloader, with an exception that you would need to be really lucky with the chunks you want to load, not to go into that last range as well. For a Mobswitch, we just need one good chunk with a low hash code for a selection of different table sizes. The minimum considered size for us would be 256, because that's the minimum hash size required to store 101 chunks. And then the maximum required reasonable hash size to support would be, depending on you, or how many chunks you would think your game would want to unload in each tick. I think 16,000, so up to 12,000 artificially loaded chunks, is a reasonable number. First of all, I don't think the game would be able to handle that many. And in single player, you would never reach it, since, for example, with one player and with a few distance of 32, for example, that's max 4,000 chunks. But you could technically exceed it if you chunk load a lot. In this case, you would want to choose a different set of requirements. So let's look at this example. Chunk 13 on X and -1 on Z. And that's this full hash code up to 20 bits, so supporting up to 1 million entries in the hash set. So it's 1, then a bunch of zeros, and then 1001. So for a table size of 256 chunks, its position in the table would be 9. If we add one more bit to the code, so 512 chunks, it's 9 as well. On 1000, 2000, 4000, 8000, 16, 32,000, quarter, and 500,000 items, it's 9th as well. So it will be very easy to find 100 chunks around it that would unload before him at a minimum required level of 256 chunks, and it won't lose its position at the beginning of that line for any reasonable expansion of the hash set. And those chunks are actually not that very rare, but you need to be flexible with them. So if you, for example, would build a Mobswitch in this chunk, you might need to find a spawner nearby and transport mobs somehow from that spawner to your chunk. To find some of these good chunks, I developed a Python script, which links in the description, that you can run to find your own configuration. I will also provide you with sample lists to find the best chunks for Mobswitches, but you can use this script to find the configuration if you have a different set of requirements. So settings here you would want to change is distance from 0, 0, so how far are you willing to go to set up your Mobswitch, which is in blocks. Then it's how long the chunk loading configuration you are willing to place. It's not that important, as it will be mostly less than 60 chunks long anyways. The hash size is just for the background image that displays the chunk unload order. It's just to show how random it looks. The reference bit size is how many bits for each location you want to view, like in our previous examples we were using 20. The max protection, that's an important parameter. We want to protect chunks with hash size of 256, so 8-bit long mask. But this defines the maximum of that mask. So 16 bits, for example, that's 48,000 chunks unloaded at once. So this is very, very safe. But you can lower it if you, for example, play single player. Like in my case, I have a render distance of 12, so 600 chunks per player. So 13 in this parameter, so up to 6,000 chunks to unload is much more than I would ever need. So each time you increase this number by 1, you are reducing the number of potential spots in the results by 2, but also making our chunk loading more reliable if we add more chunks. The minimum leeway is the unload order in the first set of 256 chunks. I will skip all the chunks with base priority greater than this. So for example, if I increase here, let's say to 32, this will get twice as many results, but they may require slightly larger chunk loading grids, which is not a problem. Chunks to protect is the minimum required chunks in the grid that will protect our chunk. So 100 is minimum, as I said, but we might want to use just a slightly bigger number here just to get this extra chunks in case we have some collisions. But if you are using any hopper chunk loading to load that configuration, either from world spawn or nether spawn area, this will add to the protection anyways, so 100 chunks should be fine. So what I do here is for each point I calculate rectangular chunk loading grids to support your chunk in question. Now those are predefined in shape, but you can technically use any funky shape of a grid you want. You would possibly want to avoid loading areas larger than a 5x5, so all the chunks stay lazy loaded, this is better on the CPU, but I also made a tool for that in carpet mode as well, in case you have a different chunk loading configuration around your protected chunk. But we'll go back to that soon. For now, I'll be displaying here 4 of them on the map, according to this parameter, and 16 of those extra configurations I'll write out to the screen. So here's all possible locations for the requirements that I just shown, and all of those are really good chunks for chunk loading, and also regardless of the dimension. It works the same in the overworld, nether, and the end. And as you can see, there's quite a bunch of them. Closest to 0, 0 are -13 and 0, and 13 and -1. As I said, you don't want the Mobswitch to be too far, because you still need to load it somehow, but you also don't want it to be too close to spawn in case you accidentally player load part of it, which can cause the rest of the grid to unload or mobs to despawn if you load the chunks with the mobs. Also, if your configuration is, let's say, 50 chunks away from spawn, unless you use some instant wire to load it, if you use hopper, it may take up to 50 ticks on starting your world for the Mobswitch to take an effect. So as I said, not too close and not too far. So here's an entry, for example, for 13 on X and -1 on Z, chunk that I was talking about. And as you can see how flexible it is in terms of expanding the hash size with all these zeros. And to protect it, we would use any of the following chunk configurations indicating the bottom left and the upper right corner of the square area where this chunk is in one of these corners. But as I said, other configurations could be tested in-game with my brand spanking new unload command. Hi and welcome to Minecraft. I'm still at 1.12, but I already wrote an unload command for 1.13 in it. So we have here in front of us a little configuration of chunks ready for 1.13. So if I do /unload, we can see we have 104 chunks in a loop with orders roughly in the same range, and that's the old hashing behavior. But if I type unload 13, it will simulate the actual 1.13 unloading with the same set of chunks. So as we can see with 104 chunks, we are awfully close. We had a bunch of collisions here. There's some other chunk with priority 8 that end up within the first 100 chunks, unfortunately, and there's also one chunk that rolled from the beginning to the end. So we are here a little bit risky, so we might want to use a little bit more than 100 chunks in this case, like 110. But in practice, you would typically add a few chunks just to load this area from spawn or whatnot. That would push all of these chunks down, so that's not a big problem. If we get to the chunk in question, so in this case -13, 0, we can do unload 13 order on that pillar, and you can see that it's order 8 and has a lot of potential space to grow. A perfect candidate for a chunk to protect. But here we have another chunk loading grid I was testing. At first, I thought that the chunks needs to be at the end of this queue to be protected, not at the beginning, until I tested it and verified with Air Computer that indeed the game unloads chunks with the new hash set from the highest hash code to the lowest. But this would be a good example of the top 100 chunks to load for a potential global permaloader, as I said, is much more complicated, as you would need to load 100 seemingly random chunks all around the world to have a chance for it to work. Yeah, so but in this example, this is a very bad chunk that no matter what you do would always be unloaded. The last capability I would like to show you is the unload protect. This is just to show how difficult it would be to protect any arbitrary area from unloading. I can start with my best chunk here, and I can specify the hash size as well I would like to test. So this chunk here can be protected with 102 chunks pretty much regardless of the hash size, because of all the zeros in this hash code. But if we, for example, choose this 3x3 area, we will run into some problems. As we can see, we can't even protect it with 2000 chunks. We need to chunk load more than 2500 chunks to keep all of those chunks here loaded because of one chunk here with very high order. And this is this one, as you can see with all its ones on the important places. Anyways, to properly protect an arbitrary 5x5 area, which is required for example for a sand farm, where you can't really choose the location, now it will be even harder and harder to do. So we are here back in 1.13, and just a little side note, regardless of any version, any loop of more than 100 chunks with hoppers in them will chunk load itself and can be used for a poor man's Mobswitch. So here, for example, I have a loop of more than 100 chunks loaded with that chunk here, with a bunch of mobs in it attached to that loop. And this loop here will always reload itself after each autosave along with all these mobs, because it has more than 100 chunks, so there will be always a few chunks that will survive. So now let me go to the remote location and see how this Mobswitch works in practice. So now we are far away from that hopper loop. As we can see, it's night, nothing is spawning. So that seems to be good, but whenever an autosave happens, that chunk will be unloaded for a few seconds, because we were quite unlucky with the selection of a particular chunk that gets saved last and kept the loop going. And that's why when we type save all and this autosave happens, we have a few spawns. And since we didn't pay any attention in terms of the hash code of that particular chunk, every time the hash resizes, we'll likely end up with a very different configuration of chunks that are being unloaded in very different order. So that's the main problem with the poor man's mob switches. And here's a proper mob switch that we have selected with our tool that would always be unloaded almost at the last place with its own pool of supporting chunks, regardless of all the viable rehashing size configurations. So we'll never fall into our 100 unloaded chunks here. And if we go back to our platform, we can now spam save all, and as we can see, there is absolutely nothing spawning, which is a success. We successfully permaloaded a single chunk. The last thing I'd like to show is a few screenshots from 1.12 where I actually caught the hash to resize down, which is not something that is easy to witness, that I observed to show that in practice these hash sizes will eventually start going down if they blow it up for whatever reason, with some chunks that accidentally roll around the hash table, which would cause the hash to downsize. Like in this case, with a few collisions we scaled down to 64, and in the other screenshot we sized down from 512 in 2 steps to 128. So we are back on the copy of my survivor world, which I use here as an example to show how to fix the mob switches in 1.13. This is all creative right now, but when I upgrade to 1.13 I would probably need to redo all the setups here in the same fashion. But by this time happens, I would likely have an unload tool for 1.13 already to determine more precisely what needs to be unloaded to have the mob switches reliable without the crazy need of loading too many chunks. But for now, that's just a proof of concept. So first of all, what I did, I filled back items back in the hoppers that led to the spawners here in the overworld as well as in the nether. That will lead us to the mob switch grids that could be loaded automatically when the world loads. One of the requirements for a successful mob switch is to keep the dimensions with the mob switch's entity processing, and for that you would need to drop items between these dimensions every less than 15 seconds. Otherwise, if there's no player in the dimension, all the hoppers stop ticking, and for that it will shut down all the chunk loading and the mob switches. So that's part of the regular mob switch technology, and that didn't change as well. So if you move to the nether, here is the location where we accept the items from the overworld spawn, and this is essentially our nether spawn because it's being constantly refreshed from the spawn chunks. And now if I go up, we can see all the chain of our previous hoppers that led to the permaloader, which is not used right now for anything apart from just allowing us to reach that chunk loading grid that I just talked about. So let me now follow this hopper chain that would lead us to the new chunk loading grid. So my goal for this exercise was to find the best spots relatively close to the existing spawners. So here was the previous mob switch in this chunk with the blaze spawner. And those blaze spawners are not that common, especially if you aim at a particular chunk. But I was able to find a good mob switch location relatively close to this one, so it should be doable. But if you're starting from scratch, you'll probably try to match the blaze spawner locations in your seed to those particular locations for the mob switches. So unfortunately in survival you have a little bit of a challenge to get the mobs to spawn where your mob spawner is and then move them away into that particular chunk that we'll be using for a mob switch. That would be especially challenging if you, for example, play a single player, because you can't really leave those blazes more than 32 blocks away because they'll start despawning. But if you're playing on multiplayer, that's actually very easy because you can just leave one account in the chunk with those blazes to keep them despawning and just move them one by one or within small packs to the location. And then once you collect enough blazes, then you need to leave the area via the nether portal and never go back to this area again. Just chunk load it from 0, 0 using hoppers or, for example, via redstone. And that would be your mob switch complete. So in the overworld, I also tried to find a location close to the existing hopper chunk loading line, which was going on the world's 0Z axis, and I found one only 2 chunks away from it. So again, I didn't need to really set up any additional chunk loading apart from the individual supporting grids for the mob switches. I also chose this location because it is relatively close to the previous mob spawner. In this case, I'll need to bring the mobs here somehow from that chunk, but I'll probably try to find another spawner that's nearby here. And that's pretty much to it. Oh, and these pesky phantoms, I haven't slept in this world for months. Maybe that's why they spawn everywhere, and unfortunately Mobswitch won't help with those either. So, let's just test how it works. So I just restarted the server, so we'll start from scratch and we'll test if those grids gonna load properly upon restart. And it seems fine. No mobs, no problem. Let's go quickly save all. A few times. Yeah, everything seems to be fine. So here we have a quick Mobswitch with a little bit over 100 hoppers. Easy to set up, and if you know exactly where to place it, also very reliable. Let's check the nether next. Yep, as I said, everything seems to be working fine so far. It's a little bit of a guessing game at this point without the ability to pick what game is unloading and in which order, so this doesn't conclude yet what I just said in the past half an hour or whatnot is exactly what's happening here, but looks like all this is just fine. And on that bombshell, it's time to end. Treat those results, as I said, as preliminary. When you get access to the 113 Forge and MCP, which is the community-based source code of the game, I'll try to confirm all my assumptions I made here today, and if something drastically changes, I'll definitely let you know. I would like to thank Earth Computer, Eddie, XCOM for their input, their discussions and their analysis on the situation as well. While it seems like the global Permaloader would be a really finicky thing to pull off, I think it would be doable if we would spot load enough really high order chunks. However, an actual 100% effective and functional Mobswitch that doesn't require any funny mobs like shulkers or withers is actually a very easy task to do if you know where to do it and have about 2 stacks of hoppers to spare. To help you find the locations for the Mobswitches, check the link in the description with the program to find them, and a few pre-generated maps with the corresponding chunk lists with the exact coordinates of the chunk loading grids, as well as the current version of the carpet mod where you can test these configurations in-game yet still on 1.12. It shouldn't matter that much where you test it, you don't even need to test it on the same world, as the unloading only depends on the chunk coordinates, so the nether overworld and the end switches could be all technically the same. So, if you are still a little confused in terms of the basic of Mobswitch mechanics, don't worry. You can check some of my previous videos on the topic of Mobswitches, which I'll link in the description. Some of the facts that I presented there are not longer true, but I think I clearly stated today what changed in 1.13 regarding that. If that still didn't help and you're still confused and you just want to have a Mobswitch running, just use the pre-made maps and the coordinates for the best locations from the configurations I shared with you below, and just chunk load them somehow from spawn like I did. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video or learned something new, because I actually learned a lot myself in terms of how these new hashtags work in details, don't forget to leave me a like, leave me a comment in the comment section below, subscribe if you're new, and see you in the next one. Bye bye!